Well, we're going to go now to Tommy Binion. Tommy Binion's from Washington, D.C. He's vice president of Heritage Foundation. Tommy is wired. He simply knows everything going on in Congress. And so I just asked him to give us an overview. Tommy, if you can share, give us the update. I'm sure you'll cover this, but update us on HR1. And most people know what that is, but go ahead and explain what HR1 is, S1. And then HR5, explain what it is and what's its status. The situation regarding the filibuster right now, the massive debt, staggering debt like we've never seen. Give us a quick overview of what's happening. I hope somehow on some of this there's some good news, but give us an overview, a realistic overview of what's transpiring right now. Tommy Binion, joy to have you on.
It's a joy to be with you. I don't know if following Congress as closely as I do is a blessing or a curse. These days, it feels more like a curse, but we see big challenges in the future. We see big challenges in the present. There are, in my view, and I think in many of your views, many things that many roads this country should not go down, many threats in terms of policy, legislation, politically that we need to avoid. And so I'll touch on all of those things you mentioned. I'll start with HR1. HR1 is, it's called the For the People Act. It is exclusively a partisan bill. It's supported only by Democrats. It has no support by Republicans. It's been around now for 3 years. And the Democrats began pitching it as a good government and ethics bill. If you look under the cover, if you read the book, if you read the bill rather, what it is principally it's about elections. It's about how elections are contested in this country. It's about who sets the rules and regulations for those elections, and it's about power. It's about campaign finance. It's about federal financing of campaigns. It's about who pays candidates. And so digging a little deeper in that surface, first thing you need to know is it would federalize elections. Right now in this country, elections are contested on the local level. Precincts report to counties, counties report to states. By and large, states will set regulations. You can vote between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. You must register to vote by 6 weeks before. You can vote absentee under the following conditions. Those are all regulations that the states set. In 2020, of course, because of the pandemic, many states, some unconstitutionally by gubernatorial fiat, changed their election regulations, allowed more absentee ballot, allowed more lax absentee balloting, those kinds of things. So that's why many of us have concerns about the integrity of our most recent elections. All that was wrong with the 2020 elections, the failure to identify everybody that was voting and to ensure that they were only voting one time, the failure to make sure that everybody was voting, was allowed to be voting, was qualified to vote, was registered to vote, was supposed to be voting, the failure to make sure that they didn't vote multiple times. All of those things that we think went wrong in 2020 would be baked in, would be guaranteed under HR1. It would provide federal financing of campaigns, but what's worse, it would allow federal candidates, if you are running for Congress in your district, to earn a salary, a massive salary from that federally funded campaign. So all you need to do to get this massive federally funded campaign salary is to register as a candidate. HR1 is very concerning. HR1 would cast doubt on all of our future elections. And again, I just go back to the point I made right at the beginning, which is that HR1 sets the rules and regulations for elections, and it is supported by only one party. You know, I think I don't need to tell you what party supports the bill for you to know that's wrong, for you to know it's wrong for one party to say these are the rules for the election. As a matter of fact, that's what Joe Manchin said. Joe Manchin's a Democratic senator from West Virginia. He came out this week and he said he's not going to support HR1 or S1, as it's known in the Senate, because it shouldn't be one party sets the rules and regulations for the election. He's deeply concerned about that, and rightfully so, for this grave sin of saying he's not going to support S1. Joe Manchin has been buried by the Democratic Party. One after another has come out and cast all kinds of dispersions at Senator Manchin, and that's very concerning. I want to dive into why that might be. Pastor Garlow mentioned the filibuster. The filibuster is the feature of the United States Senate that requires 60 votes to pass most bills. So you would think in the United States Senate, in any deliberative legislative body, it takes a majority plus one to pass a bill. And that's true in the Senate. But to cut off debate, to say we're going to finalize this legislation, we're not going to vote anymore, it takes 60 votes. And that is actually a step down from what it used to be. It used to be that one senator could make it so that the Senate couldn't cast a final vote. The Senate is meant to be a body where individual senators are empowered as individuals themselves, have great power over how the body concludes its business. Now, throughout the Senate's history, this feature, this characteristic of the United States Senate has meant that the Senate is very deliberative. They negotiate with one another. They respect each other as individuals. They incorporate their ideas. And the little bit of legislative business that is able to succeed in the Senate is only the cream of the crop. It's only that that we're sure would serve this country well. Well, that was diluted some when they put the cloture rule in. The cloture rule allows debate to be cut off by 60 senators rather than 100 senators. And so that is the regime we've lived under for close to, under various conditions, 150 years, whereby the Senate can propose a bill, it can deliberate and debate it for a number of days or weeks, and then they can invoke cloture and they can say, okay, 60 of us want to cut off debate, let's have a final vote. That is still where we are. But what the Democrats have been very public in what they want to do is they want to say, no, it's no longer going to take 60 votes. We're now going to cut off debate at 51. The problem is the 60-vote rule, and this may be a little bit too complicated. I'll just mention it briefly. The 60-vote rule, the cloture rule, is a standing rule of the Senate, which takes 2/3 of the Senate to change. And so they have to, in order to change that rule, the Democrats have to do something called the nuclear option, which means they have to deliberately misinterpret the standing rules of the United States Senate. They have to look at the Rule 19 where it says 2/3, and they have to say, we think 2/3 is 51. And they all have to vote to affirm that deliberative misinterpretation. That's what's referred to as the nuclear option. That's how one party or the other would get rid of the filibuster. And most of the Democrats have come out and said that's what they want to do in this legislative session. If they were to do that, they believe they could pass S1, although with Joe Manchin's dissension, that may not be true anymore. They believe they could make DC and Puerto Rico a state. They believe that they could increase the number of justices on the Supreme Court from 9 to 13, which would be a big deal in all types of cases, but it would be a generational change in terms of how the court rules. And they believe they can enact the entirety of the Biden agenda, which includes the spending bills I'm about to jump into. Of course, everyone is aware of the big COVID relief spending bill that passed earlier this year. That's nearly $2 trillion. $2 trillion is 150% of the amount of non-entitlement spending we do on an annual basis. So they took the spending and they doubled it and they added 50% more. And that is on top of the discretionary spending we were planning to do this year. That was in the name of COVID relief. Some of that money went to vaccine distribution. Some of that money went to schools to help them get their infrastructure in place to open. But as with anything, a lot of that money that flows from the federal government either went to waste or it went to well-lobbied interest. Big business, any entity with a big presence in Washington, D.C. probably got a piece of that money. That was the first big tranche of Biden spending. The second big tranche is going to come in the quote unquote infrastructure bill. When I say infrastructure, everyone on this call, and myself included, thinks about bridges and interstates, perhaps rail transportation. Maybe we think about broadband internet. Maybe we think about even satellite communication. We think about things that make all of our lives equally easier and better. Nobody would deny the interstate system makes our lives better, and it was worthwhile to get together and spend money as a federal government on the interstate system. And I think that's where the two parties, when they were working together, were headed. A handful of Republican senators were working on the Biden administration on a scaled down infrastructure package that was going to cost about $600 or $800 billion over an extended period of time. This week, President Biden informed that group of Republican senators that the negotiations were over and they were going to act as on a partisan basis, meaning the Democrats were going to act alone without the Republicans. What that tells me is that they want to spend about $2 trillion and they want to finance it with new taxes and higher taxes on small and medium-sized businesses. That is terrifying because you can't spend $2 trillion on interstates and broadband internet. A lot of that money will be spent the same way the COVID relief money was, on waste, fraud, and abuse. Again, I'm worried about the spending because it's unsustainable. I'm worried about the spending because I have 2 boys, 2 and 5, who will bear the cost of this debt. But I'm worried about the spending because the economy is hot right now, so hot that the economists are worried about dramatic inflation. They're worried about the cost of goods and the limited supply of goods, leading to a situation where everything gets more and more and more and more expensive. We're already seeing that in a lot of industries. Go to Home Depot and try to buy some lumber and see how much that will cost you this weekend. It'll be a lot more than you're used to paying. Of course, there are some supply chain crunches, but there are also some real big concerns in terms of how much money from both the federal government and the Fed is being pumped into the economy. That's not all, though. The Biden administration wants one more big spending package. This one comes in the form of the family plan. This is a new package of entitlements, things like college tuition, child care, mandatory paid family leave. These types of entitlements are all packed in there. And they are all packed in there, unfortunately, if you get into the details, I think in ways that are imprudent, right? Ways that are going to be too expensive, ways that are going to create bad incentives, and so on and so forth. And so those 3 things taken together, the COVID relief bill, the infrastructure package, and the family plan, add up to $6.9 trillion. And that would be in the first year of a Biden presidency. On average, we spend about $1.4 trillion, including on our Department of Defense, on basically anything that's not Medicare and Social Security. That adds up to 1.4 trillion. So we're talking about a proposed 6.9 trillion on top of it. And so you can, it's hard to wrap your mind around what $1 trillion means, but you can do the multiple there, right? We normally spend 1.3 and we're talking about spending almost 7 trillion. You can see, and by the way, it is 1.4 trillion dollars that has gotten us to this point where we are now, where we have a $28 trillion debt that is hanging over us. So I'm very concerned about the level of spending. I'm very concerned that those last 2 packages, of course, the COVID relief has already been enacted. Those last 2 packages, the infrastructure and the family plan, might be enacted because of what I was talking about just previous to that, which is the filibuster. If the Democrats can invoke what I call the nuclear option and pass those 2 bills, that terrifying spending scenario that I just painted could become a reality. A couple more threats to run through before we wrap it up and turn to questions. Pastor Garlow asked me to mention the Equality Act. The Equality Act, on its face, would make it illegal in the hiring context, in the employment context, and several others to quote unquote discriminate against folks based on their sexual orientation and gender identity. But what this does is, in practice, and the Democrats are clear that this is the intent, because when Republicans try to offer a remedy to this, it is rejected. What it means is that people with a faith that requires them, let's say, not to hire a homosexual man to teach high school or something like that at a Christian school, that those people with deeply held religious beliefs that would be forced by the federal government with no recourse or no remedy to make that hire. We've seen these cases. Pastor Garlow mentioned the Alliance Defending Freedom cases that he highlighted for many years. We've seen these cases come before the Supreme Court, always siding with the defendants who were protected by the First Amendment. Their deeply held religious beliefs were protected by the First Amendment. The Equality Act intentionally singles out those individuals and makes the exercise of their religion, in my view, illegal on purpose. The Equality Act represents an aggressive threat towards people of faith. That has passed the House. It's not passed the Senate yet. If the filibuster were to go away, it would almost surely pass. And it isn't a partisan bill. S1 was a partisan bill. There are 50 Democrats in the Senate. All 50 of them support S1, with the exception of Joe Manchin. There are 50 Democrats that support the Equality Act and a handful of Republicans. And so if the filibuster were to go away, it would almost certainly pass. It is a threat even with the filibuster in place. There are some Republicans that are working on a version of that bill that would be less offensive to the First Amendment and would offer some protection to people of faith. I'm worried that protection would be limited to just churches and not, let's say, faithful business owners. But that is an unfolding situation as those senators look for a compromise. Moving on to three more quick threats. First is big tech. Companies like Facebook and Twitter control the flow of information, and I'm deeply concerned about that. After all, we aren't allowed to hear from our former president, Donald Trump, who isn't allowed to tweet, who isn't allowed to post on Facebook, who isn't allowed to reach the American people in those ways. That is a massive exercise of power. I can't think of a private entity that has exercised that much power and influence in a single blow ever. And so, of course, that's something to be deeply skeptical of and deeply concerned about. They are the beneficiaries of federal protection. They are allowed to moderate content on their website without facing criminal liability for that content on their website. That's called Section 230, and that is under review at the moment. Republicans and Democrats are taking a look at Section 230 to say, okay, if we're not going to hold Facebook and Twitter criminally liable for the criminal activity that happens on their platforms, but we are going to allow them to go in and pick and choose what posts get to stay up, that's a bit of a mismatch, right? Either they're sort of blind to what's being posted on their platform or they're not. But if they're picking and choosing what is posted on their platform, then perhaps they should be held liable for what winds up being seen by the public. So that's a big concern that we're watching. China is, of course, our biggest geopolitical foe, and there's been a big development in terms of the U.S. response to China just this week. The Senate passed a bill, 62-38, called the Endless Frontiers Act. This is a bill that is aimed at countering China, but we are talking about the United States Senate, and we're talking about Washington, and I don't mean to be flippant, but what they've done if they've thrown a bunch of money at the problem. They've decided to spend close to $200 billion on similar investments to the things that the Chinese are investing in. Principally, one of the things is our ability to domestically produce technology here in the United States. So they've turned the National Sciences Foundation from a basic research entity and to an applied research entity. So NSF is going to be the recipient of close to $100 billion to go in and research do experiments that would lead to applied technology, and then be able to produce that. I don't think on the free market or in a private way, but in a public way, which is a big step for the United States. That's what China does, and this is a concerning way that we are thinking about countering them. The Endless Frontiers Act is not likely to pass the House anytime soon, but the vote I mentioned, 68 to 32, is a rather big vote in the Senate. So that scares me a little bit about what may happen in the House. And this brings me to my last sort of threat that I'm going to cover, and that is the chaos or crisis on the border. There is insatiable demand to achieve what is the greatest gift anybody could get on planet Earth, which is United States citizenship, which is legal residence in the greatest country in the history of man. And so demand is incredibly high. And the signal that this administration has sent from Joe Biden and Kamala Harris's career in the Senate until their campaign, until now, is that under their leadership, within their administration, if you show up on the southern border of the United States, you will not be turned away. And in fact, the reality is even more mind-boggling. Today, if you show up on the southern border of the United States, let's start with, and you try to sneak in, and you are arrested, you will be given the opportunity to claim asylum. You'll be admitted into the interior of the United States. You'll be given a court date, which could be as far as 24 months from now. And that court date actually gives you the legal ability to work in this country for those 2 years. If you can show up at a port of entry and claim asylum. You can show up at a port of entry and ask for an attorney. Kids, unaccompanied minors are being trafficked, in my view, to the United States border to do this, because if you are a minor and you show up on the border, you will be escorted into the interior of the United States. We will pay to fly you anywhere in the country to be reunited with any family member of any degree, with very little verification of whether or not that's true. So that is the situation with legal status and the border. In pretty much all of those categories I just listed, individuals that are traveling to the border are coached on how to manipulate those legal systems, and they do so very, very well, and they do so by the hundreds of thousands. But because that is such a magnet to so many people to come here, and because that magnet then requires the United States to focus so many resources on that, there is a human tragedy unfolding, which is that cartels have taken operational control of our border, and they're using it to traffic human slaves and drugs into our country every single day in border states. Semi-trucks full of people being trafficked, or semi-trucks full of drugs being trafficked into this country are interdicted, and that only scratches the surface of what's actually coming in. These are criminal enterprises that are making their bones by taking advantage of our political and lack of will to secure our border. And I think we should be compassionate, but I think the rule of law is compassionate. And so the chaos on the border, and I think it's been close to a decade that we've been hearing about the chaos on the border. Present day, June 9th, 2021, is a magnitude worse than it's ever been before in terms of numbers, in terms of lack of enforcement, and in terms of cartel control on the border. It is much, much worse than we've ever been. The sort of political sideshow this week of whether or not Vice President Harris is going to go to the border, and her reaction to that is actually quite heartbreaking because of the reality of the situation there. So I think I've touched most of the threats, at least, Pastor Garlow, you asked me to mention. and then maybe a couple of more, and I think I may have just reached my 20 minutes.
Okay, I'm going to just fire some questions at you pretty quickly, a bunch of them if I can here.
Sure.
Tommy, that was an exceptional presentation. This first one we don't need to spend more than a couple seconds on because it's been beat so hard back in the November, December, January, when you reference the unconstitutional fiats done by governors during the election. Why? This is the question that's been asked for months. Why did the courts not stand behind U.S. State constitutions on that one, and the Supreme Court not stand behind it?
I don't know. It is a great mystery. It's a little bit of a quirk of our legal system. In some of these cases, they wouldn't decide these matters until after the election had already unfolded. And then they viewed, after the election had already unfolded, they viewed that to be an intervention too great for the court system. I don't think that's how it would be handled in the future. I think if we're all just being honest, that was a mistake. What they did before the election was a mistake and a misunderstanding about what would happen after. But either way, I think we have great reason in those states to be skeptical of the election results.
I'm going to shift to, we've talked about Senator Manchin. Is Senator Sinema of Arizona no longer standing with us? She's been peeled off. Is that correct? We on both HR1 and HR5 or just HR1?
She is with us on the filibuster. So she has said publicly she will not vote to break the filibuster. She'll not invoke the nuclear option. That is something to be taken with a grain of salt, because that is the thing the Democrats want most in the world, is to break the filibuster. And so there's not much they wouldn't offer her to change her vote on that. So that applies to how she would look at the vote on S1. If it were just a final passage vote, the filibuster had already been done away with, I suspect she would support it. So it's a little bit of a chicken and the egg scenario. Is the filibuster gone? Then she may support S1. Is she supporting S1 to eliminate the filibuster? Hopefully not. She is not with us on the Equality Act.
Yeah, for sure. I had never heard before what you shared, that written into HR1 is a salary for anybody who registers to run for office. I suppose there's a certain cost with registering, a certain number of names on petitions you have to have, but wouldn't that be subject to massive fraud and abuse?
Absolutely, it's subject to massive fraud and abuse. I am not a sort of pollster. I'm not an expert on American public opinion, but I will say that it seems to me that the number one thing that makes people angry, the number one thing that activates them when I read United States history books, the things that gets us most animated, is public corruption. Is when our public officials take our money and take the authority that we've given them and steal it and abuse that authority. That's why I mentioned that, is because I think it's one of the most powerful talking points against S1, is I think it leads directly, prima facie, to public corruption.
My next question has to do with the filibuster. I thought it was kind of up and down. We get rid of the filibuster per se, or the 60 votes. But if I understood you right, you said that they had to vote that 2/3 is equal to 50%. Were you speaking hyperbole? Or, no. Okay, run that one by again. And why wouldn't that end up in a court of law so fast, as 2/3 of the Senate is not 50?
Yeah, I don't think the court is our remedy here, because the Constitution says the Senate makes its own rules. The Senate has a set of...
The 66% is 50%? That sounds Orwellian to me.
It is outrageous, and it's actually happened a couple of times before. It's sort of a play they can run now. It's called the nuclear option. You may remember the Democrats did this to eliminate the filibuster on judicial nominees in 2013. The Senate has a set of standing rules. They're numbered, and they persist from legislative session to legislative session. It takes 2/3 of the United States Senate to write or change a standing rule. The cloture rule, which is the one that says debate can only be cut off with 60 votes. This is where the filibuster lives, and the standing rules is a standing rule. It takes 2/3 vote to change. But it doesn't take 2/3 vote to write a new precedent. In addition to the standing rules, the Senate is governed by a book of precedents about 1,000 pages long. And it's basically ways that these rules have been interpreted. It's akin to case law, what these precedents are. And so in the nuclear option, they set a new precedent. What happens is somebody moves to invoke cloture. They take a vote. It's 51 to 49, and the chair says cloture is therefore invoked. A then minority senator would have to object and say, under Rule 19, cloture hasn't been invoked because only 15 senators have voted in favor. They would turn to the parliamentarian. The parliamentarian would say, that's correct. The rule says you need 2/3 or you need 60 votes to invoke cloture. And the chair would say, I don't think so. I can read that. That means 51. And then there would be a vote. And the vote would be to either affirm the rule of the chair or to affirm the objection. And that vote is non-debatable, and it only requires 51 votes to set a new precedent. So they would be officially deliberately misinterpreting the rules to set a new precedent. Now, all of us played sports, and we learned about fair play, and we learned about following the rules. And so we object to this. And the way that you can get away with this, the way that the Senate will get away with this is to obfuscate it, to bury it, to do it. One, you do it at midnight when nobody's watching. You confuse them. You use all types of terms, the vocabulary they don't use in their day-to-day life, like cloture, filibuster, and invoke, and all these things, all these ways that people don't normally talk. And you confuse them, and you say, well, this isn't about Senate rules. This is about civil rights. This is about making sure that nobody's vote is suppressed by those Republicans that want to suppress votes. So they obfuscate it. They make it about something it isn't, and they confuse the precedent. And they confuse the procedure. And that's how they get away with this. And you're going to see a lot of pushback on Republicans, especially in the states, to say that what they're doing is voter suppression. And that is, in my view, a way of making this case. This isn't about some obscure 51 vote rule. This is about voter suppression and civil rights. And that's what they want the American public to focus on. And that's how they want to manipulate public opinion.
Just rewind one sentence because I want to make sure everybody was tracking with you. If I understood you correctly, our annual budget minus Social Security, Medicare, is 1.3 or 1.4 trillion. And what if I understood you right, what Joe Biden is proposing is 6.9 trillion. Did I understand you correctly?
That is in addition to all the spending we're already doing. Now, you can't spend 6.9 trillion in 1 year. It would take them several years to get it out the door. But it isn't as if it's spread out over those years that it would take to get out the door. All of that, the 1.4 that we're going to spend anyway, plus the $2 trillion in COVID relief that we've already enacted and spent, plus an additional close to $5 trillion between the infrastructure plan and the family plan. Yes, sir, that's the math.
I can't recall exactly, but it seems to me the national debt at the end of George Bush's administration was about 9 or 10.
That's about right.
And yep. Obama, running as a candidate for president, made the statement that what George Bush had done to run up a debt that high was unpatriotic and obscene. That was the language he used. And in the next 8 years, he doubled it, I believe, from roughly 10 to 20 trillion. Now we've gone up, our national debt right now is what amount?
It's either 28 or 29 trillion today.
At what point are we no longer able to even pay the interest, let alone anything on the principal for principal reduction?
I don't know the specific answer to that question. It is a constitutional requirement that we pay that interest and we pay what is owed on the principal. That is a constitutional requirement on the United States Congress not to default on our debt. And so what they would do is, rather than miss a payment, so to speak, they would raise taxes, and they would raise taxes immediately. And that would be devastating to our economy. The way that that would have to be done whenever that date occurs would be devastating to our economy. My sense is, and I'm making an educated guess here, that date is a little bit uncertain because it depends on the economic conditions throughout the globe and how much debt we're able to roll over. The Treasury Department calls that, quote unquote, extraordinary measures. It's like calling the credit card company and sort of restructuring your debt. The United States Treasury is involved in those extraordinary measures every single day. And so our credit worthiness and then the economic conditions will affect when that date comes. But it's tremendously concerning that the future effects our debt will have on our economy. Inflation is one of them. But when our credit worthiness is no longer what it is today as a country, we will be in a world of hurt. It will be a depression that we can't imagine, economically speaking.
We're required by Constitution, you say, to pay the debt, but are we required by Constitution to have an annual budget approved? And we've been operating without an annual budget in violation of the Constitution, or am I incorrect on that?
It's not a constitutional requirement, but it is a statutory requirement. It's required by the Budget Act, the 1973 Budget Act. And it is, it's actually, we are not delinquent on that requirement. The Democrats enacted a shell budget. It basically says nothing. It's a couple pages long. It says we're going to spend whatever the amount is, $1.4 trillion this year, and case closed. They voted for it on a partisan basis in order to unlock a process in the Senate where they could pass that COVID relief bill, that $2 trillion we've been talking about. That was done by reconciliation. Reconciliation is an end run around the filibuster. You can pass a bill that is directly pursuant to a budget with only 51 votes. And so they passed what's called a shell budget, which is just it's like if you just took your income, your salary, and said, my family budget this year is whatever your salary is, and you didn't do any work in terms of what you'll spend the money on. That's what's been enacted by both parties in order to fulfill that requirement.
When you talked about the compromise that some Republicans are participating in on HR5, is that the FFA of Fairness for All?
That's one of them. The Fairness for All Act would protect religious institutions like churches, but it wouldn't protect all religious people. It wouldn't protect the religious baker who doesn't want to make a cake for a gay wedding. It wouldn't protect the religious florist who doesn't want to make floral arrangements for a gay wedding. So it is a compromise. There are those Republican senators who are searching for something that protects the First Amendment right of all people to exercise their religion and have their deeply held religious beliefs. But that compromise is fleeting. It hasn't revealed itself yet. And even if it does, I'm not sure the Democrats will go for it. They, of course, they reject FFA. So, but this might be too complicated, but I'll say it anyway so everybody understands. If they are able to find a compromise like FFA, but maybe one that protects more folks, then Republicans who would otherwise vote for the Equality Act won't. So if there's a safe place to land, if there's a bill they can say, I don't support the Equality Act, but I support this bill, then they may be able to politically survive a no vote on the Equality Act. So even if a compromise isn't likely to become law, it's still going to play a really important role in stopping HR5.
And presumably, this will be my last question. I have many more questions, but I need to stop and let you go. We got to get to praying. We assume we have no remedy in the courts on either HR1 or HR5.
That's not true. No, if they were enacted, if both chambers of Congress passed them and the president signed them and they became law, there are lots of people who would have injury and the ability to sue and the ability to advance those cases to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court would have the ability to strike those bills down. That's not likely, especially in the case of HR5. In the case of HR1, it may be that the 10th Amendment of the Constitution requires the court to strike down HR1. The court has sent several signals that it wouldn't strike down HR5, the Equality Act.
Okay. Tommy, you have given us a thorough overview. I'm going to ask just a question from the standpoint, just an overview, atmospherically. Well, I said my last question, and now I'm asking another question, aren't I? I'm like Paul writes in one of his letters, finally, my brother, and he keeps on writing. So I'm doing the same thing with Paul here. Atmospherically, what is it like? I have a friendship with a few members of Congress, but not a lot, nothing like you do. What those who stand for righteousness and godliness, how are they handling this? How are they doing?
And I'm really glad you asked me this question because I think it's something really important for you all to know and be praying about. They are demoralized and complacent. And I don't say that to insult them or to hurt their reputation, but I say that because I can see it. The 2020 election was as close as they get. The margin today in the House of Representatives is 4 seats, and the margin in the Senate is 0 seats. And there are 6 states in which the election results were in doubt and still are, and were the subject of litigation and all manner of things. That's as close as elections get. House, Senate, and White House, that's as close as it can be. But in the 7 months since the losers of that election, the Republican Party, the conservatives, have been first, they were called insurrectionists. Their patriotism and love of country and rejection of violence was questioned. Many of them were subject to, and still are, criminal investigation because of how they voted on January 6th. Not to do with anything having to do with what happened at the United States Capitol, but because of how they voted. They've been called racist. They have been called vote suppressors. They've been called all kinds of things. And the United States Capitol is a security zone like I've never seen. COVID protocols changed everything. You can't freely walk the halls of Congress anymore as you could pre-COVID. But then January 6th was a quadrupling of the security measures. They built a wall around the Capitol, the National Guard, which is a very oppressive just sort of presence because it's men and women in military uniforms driving Humvees circling the Capitol. And when you add COVID, when you add January 6th, when you add the attitude from the Democrats that Republicans are sort of the enemy within, it's a depressing atmosphere. Now, these are righteous people who feel called to do what they're doing, but they're less optimistic than ever before, even as close as they are. I said they were demoralized. I also said they're complacent. They're going to win the majority in 2022. It looks like there's a 4-seat margin, and they're in the minority with a brand new president in the White House. Almost always, the minority party will win that election. And so they're a little bit complacent waiting for that. And I just listed a whole bunch of bad things that might happen before that. And so I'm worried about that complacency as well. I know it's a long-winded answer, but I think it's pretty important to get out there.
HR1 goes through, there's a lot of disillusionment among voters with values across the country too, that their votes wouldn't count anymore, which really sets us in for a terrific dilemma. Tommy, you have been wonderful. Thank you so much. If your schedule would allow, we invite you to stay on, though I know you're visiting with some relatives, so we want to excuse you to get back to your relatives who graciously allowed you to come with us. But this was exceptionally thorough. Thank you so much for that. So appreciative. We're going to be
Thank
praying.
you for the invitation and for praying for me and all these issues.
I'm going to pray for you right now and then let you go. Father, I pray blessing and protection upon Tommy. Thank you for his stand. Thank you for the ministry he has. Thank you for the calling and the anointing you put upon his life, the clarity of his thinking, the articulation skills that you put within him. Lord, bless this man. Protect him in the name of Jesus. Amen.